All right, this is the first of many lectures, pre-recorded lectures, and this is really the first topic that I talk about in class, and it's guidelines for choosing topics. Now, this applies to many of the topics you may be, or many speeches you may be asked to give in the course of your lifetime. It doesn't apply to all of them, and it doesn't necessarily apply to all the speeches that you're giving in class. But here are some three general guidelines. Each of these are going to be mini lectures, about 7 minutes long. So this is the first part of those three. So the first guideline for choosing topics is to find a topic that relates to your experience, your interests, or your expertise. So one good place to start is looking at your career goals. Do you know where you want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now? It might be worth investigating that particular area and maybe something very specific. It's not necessarily, hey, I want to be, an internet god, or I want to I want to be like Jeff Bezos and own my own massive company, but something a little bit more specific. You might also, if you're not sure where you're going to be 5 years from now, you might want to look at your major or look at other classes that you're taking. Classes like psychology, for example, are great for speech topics. Everybody's usually quite curious about, why do we do things the way that we do, and why do we think about things the way we do? So psychology is usually a good field, but really any field of study that you find interesting, or if you're taking a class and you just are thinking to yourself, I want to be able to know more information, maybe it's a history class, maybe it's a sociology class, there's going to be a topic in there that would certainly be good for a speech. So it kind of depends on where you want to put your energy. Finally, it might be a topic that you're simply interested in. And so then the question comes to, what do you investigate when you're not doing your homework? What do you look at online? What are you fascinated by? And so that may be sort of a driving motivation for doing a speech. So maybe it's about, if you like, investigating serial killers or ghost hunting, maybe the speech is there. If you're a movie buff, then maybe it's something specific about a movie. If you love sports, maybe it's something unusual about sports or a particular sport, like, injuries and deaths or something, so it might be that you go into that direction. And again, those things could also relate to your life as well. I've had a lot of athletes talk about a particular injury, which is always significant and always very timely. And it's good for anybody who's had an injury to really kind of understand what's going on. So this is really the first step that you want to think about when you're looking at choosing some kind of topic. Now, with that in mind, there are some cautions that you need to think about. And these are not necessarily, you can't do this topic. It's not a list like that, but it's sort of as you're thinking about topics to do, there may be some things you might want to try to avoid. The first of those being a topic that might be too familiar to an audience. Now, I can think of one thing at this point, there's many things, but one thing that is way too familiar for everybody. We've all been living it, we've been reading about it, we have experience with it, and if you haven't thought of coronavirus yet, then somewhere you have been living in a bubble. So if we're looking at like standard information about coronavirus, where did it come from? What's the infection rate? What are the symptoms? What are the outcomes? What are the possible cures? Of course, none yet at this point. Who's ahead on the vaccines? We're just beginning to get that information. But a lot of that information about coronavirus, the importance of wearing a mask, the importance of social distancing, people know already. So you really don't need to give them that information again, because they will simply think to themselves, I know this already, and then they will simply check out. So you want to make sure that any information you give them is new information, or could perhaps be familiar information done in a creative and new way. So that would be, again, a way in which you could talk about coronavirus. If you're like looking at the deaths, for example, I saw one really brilliant blog that compared it to airline crashes, and that was like, well, that's really interesting. I never thought of it that way. A second thing you want to be careful of is a topic that might be too emotional for you, and this doesn't mean that it doesn't refer to the passion that you have for the topic or enthusiasm you have for the topic. It means that the topic that you're addressing is associated with some kind of trauma or some kind of sadness in your life that maybe you're not ready to talk about yet. I've had a number of students that have broken down in the middle of a speech or at the beginning of a speech because they're doing a speech, for example, on the effects of drinking and driving or the effects of smoking cigarettes. And so what we find out soon in the speech is that they have a family member who died in a drunk driving accident, or was a victim in a drunk driving accident, or a family member who had lung cancer. And what that means is these are topics that are just too difficult to do at that time. So the distinction here is that what you can talk about when you're comfortable and relaxed with your friends is very different than what you can talk about when you're nervous. And when you're nervous, all of a sudden those feelings kind of rush to the forefront. I had one example where I was giving a speech in front of the administration, the staff, and the faculty, and I mentioned my father passing away. This was a number of years ago. And I felt it was important to talk about it because it related to the topic that I was addressing. And so as I was talking about my dad, that little lump sort of moved up in my throat, and I thought to myself at that moment, you know, I tell students not to do this because of this, and here I'm doing it. But because I'm a professional and I get paid to do this kind of stuff, I had sort of the presence of mind and the strength to kind of take a moment, kind of push the lump back down my throat, say, I'm not going there today, and then I continued with my speech. And of course, everybody was very moved that there was that moment of quietness. The reality, though, is that you don't want to put your audience through that. An audience will immediately sympathize with a speaker if they sense that this grief is genuine. We know when grief is genuine and when it's not, but if it's genuine, the audience will be right there for you. And it's difficult to put an audience through that. And you really don't want to put yourself through that. Public speaking is stressful enough without having the added burden that you might break down because the topic is too close. So again, what you can talk about when you're relaxed is not necessarily what you can talk about when you're nervous. And then finally, the last caution is you want to be careful that your topic isn't too trivial. Now, in my career of teaching, and I've heard over 1 million speeches, yes, I've done the math, I've had probably 5 belly button lint speeches, and none of them were good. I mean, there's probably a real good way to kind of spin that so that it's funny and weird and just right off just off the charts strange, but it was simply people that didn't have enough time or just didn't care that much to think about the audience, and so they did it on belly button lint, and so the audience is then left wondering, why am I listening to this? Why am I wasting my 5 minutes or 7 minutes? Now, the reality is you do this all the time in class. When an instructor goes off on a tangent and talks about their pet puppy or their trip to Cancun or whatever it is, and you're thinking, is this going to be on a quiz? Do I need to know this? So an audience is very selfish with their time. And so when you talk about something that's trivial, essentially what you're doing is you're saying, I don't care about your time. I'm just going to trash it. This is my time. And that doesn't engender any good feelings on the part of the audience. So there you go. That's the first guideline for choosing topics, is starting with yourself in terms of what you're passionate about, what you're interested in, and making sure that it's going to be significant for the audience. In the next 2 videos, we're going to now turn the focus on the audience and the occasion and the topic itself.